Grant Pemberton had a folder under his arm and a company truck idling in the driveway when he told Ruth Okonkwo-Baird that her creek was finished. Not damaged. Finished. 40 years, he said, maybe longer, before anything in that water table would test clean again, and the Halstead Paper Company was prepared to make her a fair offer for the affected 22 acres, effective immediately, so everyone could move forward. Ruth had been expecting him for 3 weeks, ever since the mill's containment berm failed during a February storm and sent an estimated 11,000 gallons of pulping liquor, thick with residual lignin, sulfur compounds, and chlorinated bleaching byproducts, down the drainage ditch that fed directly into Miller's Creek, the same creek that crossed the northeast corner of her property before continuing on to 3 more farms downstream. She'd read the incident report the county filed. She'd read the water tests, the ones the State Department of Environmental Quality had run within 72 hours, showing contamination levels that made even the county extension agent go quiet on the phone. And she'd read Grant Pemberton's letter, the one that arrived 8 days before he showed up in person, using the word regrettable twice and the word liable not at all. 40 years is generous, Grant said, standing in her driveway with the kind of practiced calm that comes from delivering bad news for a living. Realistically, closer to 60 for full soil recovery. I've seen the DEQ modeling. This isn't a negotiation, Mrs. Okonkwo-Baird. I'm here because the company wants to do right by you before this gets complicated for everyone. Ruth looked past him at the creek line, where the water still ran the wrong color 3 weeks after the spill, a dull gray-brown that caught the light strangely. Then she looked back at Grant Pemberton and said the only thing she'd say to him that day. "Give me until October." He laughed, not unkindly, the laugh of a man who has heard a lot of things from a lot of landowners and stopped being surprised by any of them. October to do what? To show you what 40 years actually looks like. If you've ever been told something was beyond saving by someone who never bothered to check, stay with us. This is the story of what Ruth Okonkwo-Baird knew that a company with a legal department and a public relations budget didn't. Ruth was 51 years old and had spent 11 years before she ever farmed a single acre, working as a soil remediation specialist for an environmental consulting firm out of Portland. The kind of job that sent her to Superfund sites and old industrial yards to figure out what could be done with ground that everyone assumed was a write-off. She'd left that career at 42, tired of consulting for companies who mostly wanted a report that let them do the minimum, and bought 60 acres in a river valley 2 states away with the idea of running a small, diversified farm and finally working land instead of just analyzing it. She grew vegetables for 3 restaurants and a Saturday market, kept a modest orchard, and hadn't thought much about her old profession in almost a decade. Miller's Creek ran along her northeast property line, clean and unremarkable, home to a few native trout populations the county listed as stable but not thriving. She fished it sometimes on Sunday mornings. It was, until February, the least interesting piece of her property. What Grant Pemberton and the Halstead Paper Company didn't know when they drove out to make their offer was that the woman they were talking to had spent a decade reading soil contamination reports the way most people read the newspaper, and that somewhere in a filing cabinet in her farmhouse office sat a stack of old case studies from her consulting years, several of them involving a technique that most landowners, most lawyers, and apparently most paper mill liability officers had never heard of. Mycoremediation. The use of fungi, specifically certain species of wood decay and litter decomposing mushrooms, to break down complex organic pollutants, including exactly the kind of lignin derivatives, chlorinated compounds, and sulfur-based residues that had just been dumped into her creek. She didn't tell Grant Pemberton any of this in the driveway. She'd learned a long time ago, in her consulting years, that the fastest way to get a company's legal team fully engaged against you was to let them know you understood their liability exposure better than they did. So she said nothing about Mycoremediation. She said, October. And she let him drive away thinking he was dealing with a farmer who needed time to grieve a loss, instead of a specialist who was already running numbers in her head before his truck cleared the gate. The technical case for what Ruth intended to do rested on a specific biological fact she'd seen demonstrated in 3 separate remediation projects during her consulting years. Certain fungi, most reliably oyster mushrooms and related species in the genus Pleurotus, produce extracellular enzymes, primarily lignin peroxidase and manganese peroxidase, that evolved to break down lignin, the tough structural polymer that makes wood rigid. Lignin and many industrial pollutants, including the pulping liquor and chlorinated byproducts in Halstead's spill, share a similar complex molecular structure. The same enzymes that let a mushroom digest a fallen log can, under the right conditions, break those pollutant molecules down into simpler, less toxic compounds. It wasn't a magic trick. It was a documented technique with a real research history going back to the 1990s, but it had never scaled well outside laboratory conditions, and it required exact conditions to work at meaningful speed. The right fungal species, sufficient moisture, adequate oxygen, and a substrate that gave the mycelium somewhere to establish itself before it could attack the pollutants directly. Ruth spent the first week after Grant's visit running her own site assessment. She tested soil and water at 9 points around the affected quarter-mile of creek bank, mapped contamination concentration against distance from the discharge point, and confirmed what she suspected. The pollution was real, but it was concentrated in the top 18 inches of soil and the immediate streambed sediment, not driven deep into the water table the way Grant's 60-year estimate implied. She called the Mycological Supply Lab in Washington State and ordered 80 pounds of oyster mushroom spawn grown on a straw and hardwood chip substrate, chosen because the coarse texture would let her build absorbent mats directly into the contaminated ground. Total cost, including overnight shipping, $610. Her first attempt, laid down in the second week of March, failed within 9 days. Spring runoff swelled the creek twice that week, submerging the mats and drowning the mycelium before it had a chance to establish. Fungi need oxygen to grow. Standing water kills it as surely as it kills most other things trying to breathe. She'd made a mistake she wouldn't have made on a client site with a proper timeline. She'd rushed the placement to beat Grant Pemberton's calendar instead of her own creek's calendar. Grant Pemberton called twice in April, each time a little less patient than the last. The company's legal department wanted the affected acreage either purchased or formally released from further liability claims before the fiscal quarter closed. And Ruth's silence was becoming, in his words, a complicating factor. He drove out a second time in mid-April with a revised offer, 12% higher than the first, and a soil scientist from Halstead's own environmental compliance team, a younger man named Dennis Achibi, who spoke carefully and avoided looking directly at the creek. "We've run our own updated models," Dennis said, pausing for a moment, clearly tired from a long week of site visits. "The contamination plume is stable but persistent. Nothing in our data suggests natural attenuation on any timeline shorter than what Mr. Pemberton described." "Your data's probably right," Ruth said. "Natural attenuation is slow. I'm not counting on nature to do this by itself." Dennis looked at her with the first real curiosity anyone from Halstead had shown. "What are you counting on?" She didn't answer him directly. She walked them both down to the creek instead, past the second remediation attempt she'd laid in April. This one built correctly. Raised beds of inoculated straw and wood chips constructed above the floodline, angled to drain rather than pool, checked daily for moisture and covered with burlap to hold humidity without drowning the mycelium underneath. Dennis crouched at the edge of one bed and studied the faint white threading visible where the burlap had shifted. "Is that fungal growth?" 14 days in. It's establishing. Establishing to do what? Ask your legal department what lignin peroxidase does to chlorinated organic compounds. They'll have someone who can answer that in about an hour. And then you'll understand exactly what I'm doing out here. And exactly why I asked for until October, instead of 20 minutes with your first offer. Grant Pemberton didn't come back with a third offer that month. What came instead, in early May, was a letter from Halstead's legal counsel, considerably more formal than anything Grant had said in person, noting that any unauthorized remediation activity on the affected property was undertaken at the landowner's sole risk and would not be construed as an admission of extended liability by the company. Ruth read it twice, filed it in the same cabinet as her old consulting reports, and kept working. The beds needed constant attention through May and June.
She lost a third of one bed to a mold contaminant she identified as trichoderma, the same aggressive competitor species that plagues indoor mushroom cultivation, outcompeting her oyster mycelium in a section where drainage had been slightly worse than the rest. She rebuilt that section from scratch in early June, adjusting the substrate ratio to drain faster, and it was the last section she lost that season. By August, 5 months after the spill, the visible change in the creek corridor was significant enough that 2 of the downstream farms had started asking Ruth questions of their own. The dull gray-brown discoloration that had persisted through spring was gone from the section running through her raised beds, though it remained visible both upstream at the original discharge point beyond her control and downstream past the last bed she'd installed.
She sent soil and water samples to an independent certified lab in July and again in September, paying out of pocket both times, roughly $1,100 total, because she knew results she generated herself would carry no weight against a company with its own testing division. The July results showed contaminant concentrations reduced by nearly 60% in the treated zone compared to the untreated sections upstream. The September results, after a second inoculation cycle using a more aggressive strain, showed reduction over 80%, with several of the most concerning chlorinated compounds below the state's detection threshold entirely. Ruth called Grant Pemberton in the last week of September, the first time she'd initiated contact since the driveway conversation in February, and asked him to bring Dennis Achebe to see the site before she sent the lab results to the state as part of a formal reassessment request. They came on the 2nd of October, 4 days before the deadline she'd given him back in February. Grant walked the creek bank in a suit wrong for the terrain, Dennis beside him in boots that suggested he'd learned something from the April visit. Ruth handed both of them copies of the lab results, July and September side by side, along with a one-page summary of the protocol, written the way she used to write reports for clients who needed the science translated into something a board could approve in one reading. Grant read the numbers twice. He looked at the creek, running clear now through the section she treated, then at the still discolored water above her property line, where the original spill site remained untouched. "This is your section," he said slowly. "Just this section." "That's right. The rest of the plume, upstream and down, is still exactly what our models predicted." "It is, because nobody treated it." "What I'm showing you isn't that your 60-year estimate was fantasy, Mr. Pemberton. I'm showing you it was a choice. You modeled what happens when nothing is done. I'm the data point for what happens when something is." Dennis Achebe crouched at the creek's edge, the way he had in April, this time putting his hand directly in the water, testing something Ruth suspected had less to do with chemistry and more to do with simply needing to touch what the numbers described. He stood up and looked at Grant, then at Ruth. "I'd like to bring this to the remediation team, formally, not as a legal strategy, as a method." The agreement Halstead's legal department eventually signed with Ruth in November didn't look like the buyout Grant Pemberton had walked into her driveway offering back in February. Instead, The company funded a full mycoremediation program across the remaining affected creek corridor, contracting Ruth directly as a remediation consultant at a daily rate that made her old Portland salary look modest, with the explicit goal of restoring the full quarter-mile to pre-spill water quality within 18 months, rather than the 60 years originally modeled. It wasn't purely generosity. Ruth's independent lab results, combined with her decade of consulting credentials, had put Halstead in a position where continuing to claim the land was unsalvageable after she'd publicly demonstrated otherwise on a fifth of the affected acreage, created more legal exposure than funding the fix. But generosity was never the point. The creek being clean was the point, and by the following spring, the trout population the county had listed as stable but not thriving showed the first measurable increase in juvenile fish counts in 6 years of monitoring data.
Dennis Achebe left his position at Halstead's compliance division 14 months later to start an independent environmental remediation firm, and the first call he made was to Ruth, asking if she'd consult on a site in a neighboring state, a closed textile dye facility with a contamination problem that looked, in his words, exactly like the kind of thing your mushrooms would eat for breakfast. Grant Pemberton still calls Ruth occasionally, though not about liability anymore. He calls when a new spill or containment failure crosses his desk somewhere in the company's regional operations, asking whether it's the kind of contamination her method could address, a question he never once considered asking anyone before the October he spent 4 days worrying about what a farmer with a folder of lab results was about to send to the state. Ruth still fishes Miller's Creek on Sunday mornings, the way she did before any of it happened. She doesn't tell the story as a victory over the company, and she's careful to say so whenever someone asks. Halstead's spill was still a failure that shouldn't have happened, still cost 3 downstream farms a season of uncertainty, still put contaminants into water that should never have carried them. What she tells people instead is simpler. Nobody in that driveway back in February had lied to her. Grant Pemberton believed his 60-year number completely, because it was the only number his models had ever needed to calculate. He had simply never been given a reason to ask a different question. Some fights aren't won by proving the other side wrong. They're won by giving them a better question to ask, and then having the answer ready before they finish asking it. If this story reminded you that expertise dismissed too quickly usually asks to be underestimated exactly once, subscribe and stay with us. And tell us, has anyone ever told you something couldn't be fixed right before you fixed it?